Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Aesthetics of Extinction, featuring the work of Sugata and Stefan Scrimshire. I'm Evan Graves, Assistant Director at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and we're really happy you could join us today for this exciting event. Institute of Sacred Music, if you don't know, is an interdisciplinary graduate center here at Yale, dedicated to the study and practice of sacred music, worship, and the related arts. And today's webinar is the third in a series that is titled Mass Extinction, Art, Ritual, Story, and the Sacred. If you would like to register for upcoming webinars in this series, please follow the link down in the chat, and that will show you the list of our one upcoming webinar in this series, which you will have to register for separately. Today's webinar also follows closely on the heels of the start of a new program here at the Institute of Sacred Music. I'm delighted to announce the launch of our Religion, Ecology, and Expressive Culture Initiative. This project seeks to foster dialogue and disseminate work by scholars, artists, leaders, and activists across all disciplines and religious and indigenous traditions who work at the intersection of religion, ecology, and the arts. I encourage you to follow the link in our chat to explore more about the initiative and see our call for proposals. We will be accepting proposals for projects ranging from conferences to performances and from art exhibitions to virtual events until March 30th. So there's more information about eligibility and the application process online. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the convener of this webinar series and our moderator for today, Dr. Ryan Dar. Dr. Dar is a postdoctoral associate in religion, ecology, and expressive culture here at the ISM. And his research and teaching studies mass extinction through the lens of theology, philosophy, and literature.
Thanks, Evan. And welcome again, everybody, to the third webinar in our series, Mass Extinction, Art, Ritual, Story, and the Sacred. In this series, we're exploring the topic of mass extinction through the lens of art, ritual, story, and the sacred to better understand not only what is happening, but also what it means, how we are a part of it, and how we can respond. Today's webinar is titled The Aesthetics of Extinction, and it features two wonderful scholars, each of whom are engaged in quite different ways in research and practice that explores the intersection of art, religion, and extinction. So we'll follow the same pattern for this webinar as the last two, but for those who weren't here for the last two, let me explain. I'm going to begin by introducing both of our speakers. They'll then speak for 15 to 20 minutes each. First Sugata, then Stefan. I'll then give them an opportunity for dialogue if either would like to comment on or ask a question of the other. And then we'll turn to Q&A. You can submit your questions in writing using the Q&A function at any point throughout the webinar, and I'll be compiling them, and then we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So now let me introduce both of our speakers. Sugata Ray is an associate professor of South and Southeast Asian art and architecture in the departments of history of art, and South and Southeast Asian studies. His recent books include Climate Change and the Art of Devotion, Geoaesthetics and the Land of Krishna, 1550 to 1850, that's from 2020, and the co-edited collection, Water Histories in Southeast Asia, The Materiality of Liquiescence, from 2019. He's currently writing a book on Anthropocene Extinction in the early modern period. Stefan Scrimshire is an associate professor of theology and religious studies at the University of Leeds, UK. His research focus is the theological and philosophical dimensions of climate change and ecological activism. More specifically, the legacy of Christian apocalyptic, utopian, and eschatological belief on extinction narratives. He's currently leading 3 research projects in this area. The first called Religion and Extinction, the second Thinking Through Extinction, and the third is the Lieberhume Extinction Studies Doctoral Training Program. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Sugata, whose talk is titled Dead as a Dodo, Visualizing Anthropocene Extinction in the Early Modern World.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Evan, for inviting me, and thanks to the ISM for organizing this wonderful series of conversations. So as an art historian, I have images. So let me start by sharing my screen. This is a very new project, so I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts, your comments as I let me start since we have 1 hour. In 1600, Jacob van Meck's report of the second Dutch expedition to India was published in Amsterdam. When the second edition appeared in the very next year, an engraving titled How We Live on the Island Mauritius, otherwise named Docerne, was included in the report. As the first published image of the dodo, the flightless pigeon entered global history in the shadow of the 1598 Dutch expedition to Asia. Within a century, the bird was extinct. In fact, all three identified species in the engraving, the Mauritian giant tortoise, the dodo, and the broad-billed parrot, would be extinct soon after due to deforestation, indiscriminate hunting, and the introduction of non-indigenous animals such as rats, cats, and pigs. The Anthropocene extinction, or the age of human-induced mass extinction, was thus inaugurated. Although scholars suggest that James Watt's design of the steam engine or atomic weapons testing in the 1960s initiated the Anthropocene as the period in which human activity has become the dominant force on the environment, European ecological imperialism from the 1500s can be seen as an equally devastating origin story of our current mass biodiversity extinction. And what we see on the screen are only a few examples of the species that have gone extinct from the 1500s onwards. Often described as the sixth mass extinction event, the most cataclysmic extinction event after the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction that saw the demise of dinosaurs around 65 million years ago, the loss of vertebrate animals has, for instance, moved forward 24 to 85 times faster after 1500 than during the Cretaceous mass extinction. However, among the many species that were condemned to extinction in the last 500 years or so under colonial regimes globally, it is the ill-fated dodo that became an early icon of the Anthropocene extinction. In 1847, the British naturalists Hugh Strickland and Alexander Melville published a book based on the author's study of specimens such as the dodo that had entered the Oxford collection in 1683. In the introduction to the book, Strickland and Melville noted, and I quote the authors, "These singular birds furnish the first clearly attested instance of the extinction of organic species through human agency." Shortly after the publication of the book, a life-size model of the bird was displayed at the 1851 Great Exhibition in London, where it would be seen by over 6 million people. By 1865, the dodo was squarely embedded in the popular imagination with the publication of Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, in which the extinct bird initiates a caucus race. In tandem, an increasing awareness of human-induced species extinction led scientists to mine early modern accounts, some based on first-hand observation and others on hearsay, to better understand the fate of the doomed bird. While the etymology of the word dodo is still unclear, the OED traces the origin of the word to the Portuguese dodo, a simpleton or a fool. The word dodo first appeared in print in 1634 in a travel narrative by Thomas Herbert, a member of the 1627 English diplomatic mission to Safavid, Iran. Stereotypes flourished. Dead as a dodo, an oversized bird with tiny wings, a species that went extinct because of its ineptitude to come to terms with the socio-environment transformations that were part and parcel of the global dispersal of Western European modernity. And incidentally, the phrase dead as a dodo was used in 1852 in a magazine edited by Charles Dickens to describe an officer in the Royal Navy. Despite having never visited Mauritius, the Dutch physician Jacobus Bontius had described the dodo as slow-going and stupid, stupida, and easily taken by hunters as early as 1658 in a book on the natural history of the East Indies. The mischaracterization of the bird as stupid became entrenched in European natural histories. Even in the 18th century, the French naturalist Jacques Valmont-Beaumar described the dodo as very stupid, while Comte de Buffon, one of the earliest naturalists to theorize ecological succession, indicated that the dodo's sole purpose was to give us an idea of the heaviest of all beings. It is thus not surprising that when the Flemish artist Roelandt Savery completed around 10 paintings of the bird, he visualized the dodo as an overweight, immobile creature that gazed vacantly without any trace of life force. Often considered to be one of the most important dodo paintings by Savery, the Mannerist landscape on the screen is striking in its staging of the fall of man. That the metaphor of loss, with Adam and Eve eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge, is not set in a hoary biblical past, but in Europe's global present, is evident from the inclusion of a dodo, a bird that had only been discovered by Europeans a few decades earlier, in the right corner. And here is one more example. This painting was owned by the naturalist Hans Sloan, who presented to the British Museum in 1759. Savery's corpulent dodo was reproduced repeatedly over the next few centuries. It served as a model for the bird in Alice's Adventure and as the frontispiece to Strickland and Melville's book. Upon encountering the painting in Berlin, Strickland had noted, "I was much pleased by finding a picture bearing the name of Roelandt Savery, 1626, containing a figure of the dodo, exactly like the one by the same artist at The Hague. It represents Adam and Eve in paradise and is crowded with animals of all kinds, most accurately depicted. The figure of the dodo is in the usual attitude in which the bird is represented, but the beak is less hooked and more like what we would know to be in real form." Despite having studied only a few fragmentary bones, Strickland wholeheartedly believed that Savery's painting of the dodo was an objective and scientific representation, and in this sense, a clear indicator of the, and I quote Strickland here, "grotesque proportions and gigantic immaturity of the bird." Recent zooarchaeological analysis, however, have revealed that the bird had longer legs, a straighter neck, and a less bulky body. In contrast to Savery's corpulent dodo, the image of a sinewy, long-legged bird in Jacob van Nek's 1601 report was then closer to the bird's physiognomy. The transformation of the dodo into a languid, corpulent creature, it seems, transpired in less than 2 decades. And arguably, the metamorphosis of the bird was shaped by Dutch colonial environmental policy and in the Indian Ocean islands, such as Mauritius. And it was Savery's portrait of an unwieldy, obese bird set in a primeval Edenic landscape that determined how Europeans imagined the dodo from the 17th century onwards. Corpulence was already associated with the diseased body in 17th century Europe. The stigmatization of fatness, however, took on a more disturbing biopolitical weight when applied to climatic worlds beyond temperate Europe. In Europe's imagination, the obesogenic tropics inevitably led to indolence and weakness. And it is in this colonial theater of physiological indolence and monstrous corpulence that we must cast the hapless dodo, doomed as it were to extinction. As for the dodo, paleontologists have shown us the fallacy of early modern scientificism that marked the bird as stupid. Historians have traced the global circulation of the bird under Dutch colonialism, and this is a fascinating example of an entry in the Dutch archive that shows a dodo being brought to Japan in 1647, and art historians have analyzed the iconography of the bird, of representations of the bird from the 1600s onwards. While much has been written on the biotechnological apparatuses that expedited the extinction of the dodo, the role of early modern artistic cultures in framing ecocide as the story of Europe's global modernity still bears underscoring. It is in relationship to this matrix of imperialism and environmental determinism that we might revisit the science writer David Quamment's oft-quoted requiem to the last dodo of Mauritius. Imagine a single survivor, a lone fugitive at large on mainland Mauritius at the end of the 17th century. Imagine this fugitive as a female. She would have been bulky and flightless and befuddled, but resourceful enough to have escaped and endured when the other birds didn't, or else she was lucky. Imagine that her last hatchling had been snuffed by a pig, that her last fertile egg had been eaten by a monkey, that her mate was dead, clubbed by a hungry Dutch sailor, and she had no hope of finding another. During the past dozen years, longer than a bird could remember, she had not even set eyes on a member of her own species. In the dark of an early morning in 1667, during a rainstorm, she took cover beneath a cold stone ledge at the base of one of the Black River cliffs. She drew her head down against her body, fluffed her feathers for warmth, squinted in patient misery. She waited. She did not know it, nor did anyone else, but she was the only dodo on earth. When the storm passed, she never opened her eyes. This is extinction. Bulky, befuddled, aged, she, the abject dodo, can only elicit remorse and deep sorrow. All we hear is the dodo's helpless song of despair as the bird faces modernity, squints in misery, and eventually dies. Quamment's elegy hints on the dodo's inability to cope with the arrival of European modernity in the form of a hungry Dutch sailor and a pig in pristine Mauritius. The rhetoric of extinction as incommensurability was not Quamment's alone. In 1847, Strickland and Melville had seen the bird's fate through the lens of a fetishized eco-nostalgia for a primeval pre-colonial wilderness. And I quote them, "We cannot see without regret the extinction of the last individual of any race of organic beings whose progenitors colonized the pre-Adamite earth. But our consolation must be found in the reflection that man is destined by his creator to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it." The regret of human-induced extinction could be tempered, according to the authors, by conjoining stewardship and ecological domination through the Genesis. While the assurance of a moral compass offered by Christian theology has far less purchase today, artistic projects such as Harry Callio's photographs of life-size models of dodos or David Beck's bronze reconstruction of the bird now serves as a mode of memorializing or remembering the trauma of colonial extinction. Visualizing extinction as a form of ecological mourning, nonetheless, conveys much more about human perceptions of the environment than it does of the environment itself. The affective power of visualizing extinction consequently becomes an ekphrastic synagogy for us, the human species, to come to terms with both the trauma of the global dispersal of Western modernity and a future in which our own survival is under threat. Thus, rather than naturalizing nature, that is, reading visualizations as somehow offering a direct access to the historical dodo, a critical examination of the ways in which the other, non-human or otherwise, was historically constituted via representational norms offers a framework to comprehend the epistemic violence through which ecocide was established as the de facto story of European modernity's global teleology. Even though post-2000 excavations in a rich fossiliferous area in southeastern Mauritius have revealed over 276 dodo board fragments, very little, however, is known about the bird beyond the fact that the dodo fed on fallen fruits and coexisted with other species such as giant tortoises. Indeed, despite recent skeletal analysis that have established that dodo was an indisputably resilient species, despite the long discourse of early modern literary accounts and visual accounts that imagine the bird as stupid and fat, Paleontologists still note that we are only starting to fill in major gaps in our knowledge regarding the dodo. The fragmented understanding of the bird's anatomy and ecology is in part because, except for one entirely complete skeleton discovered around 1904, all the reconstruction of the birds from the 17th century onwards are composite and thus partial. Moreover, the skeletal remains excavated in Mauritius were collected by museums and research institutes across the world without any contextual data. The fragmented skulls, beaks, pieces of bone that one encounters in museums and university collections do not offer any clue regarding the dodo's place in the world. Pathologized, specimenized, and museumized, the hapless dodo can then only bear silent witness to the finitude of human exceptionalism. It is thus all the more necessary today to excavate the complicity between European capital formation and aesthetic regimes that was directly responsible for the genocide of the Anthropocene extinction. After all, Savery's painting of the obese dodo, a bird that was apparently incapable of enduring modernity because of its natural ineptitude, became the foundation for both scientific and cultural perceptions of human extinction in colonial world. In lieu of the song of the dodo, to borrow from the title of Kwame's book on island ecologies, all we can hear today is the silence of extinction. Is the trauma of extinction the only recourse for a species that could not purportedly come to term with the natural, so ostensible natural and inevitable progress of European modernity? Is incommensurability extinction? All I can present then is the uncanny stillness of a bird silenced, misrepresented, mocked, and ridiculed in Europe's art historical archive. As non-figurative rupture, this silence disrupts the human, or more specifically, the European belief in speech as the site for the articulation of agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Sugata. That was fantastic. It's fascinating. So let me just remind you once again that we'll be doing questions at the end, but you're welcome to submit questions to the Q&A function at any time. I'm now going to turn it over to Stefan, whose talk is titled Creating, Thinking, and Feeling Through Extinction. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you to the organizers of this, and thank you to Sugata for that really interesting talk. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So the simple claim I want to make is that the sixth extinction is a problem for the imagination, and to the public imagination in particular. And that was also the starting premise of a collaborative research project that is coming to a close, and which I want to reflect on here. I guess if I could give this a different title, I'd say something like, do we have to talk about extinction to talk about extinction? Which I hope will make sense. But when I use the word problem, I mean to suggest more than that imagining a mass extinction crisis is difficult, although I certainly do mean that too. But in addition, I mean that the very idea of engaging public imagination with this phenomenon is problematic due to its legacy in a certain history and worldview. So whilst I'm talking mainly about a very contemporary engagement with this concept, I rely very much on the sort of genealogy of that idea that it seems to me like Sugata and others are doing. So first, there's an assumption, I think, by communicators of the mass extinction that our first responsibility is to convey a scalar shift in our thinking. So we're by now familiar with the dramatic comparison by which humanity is likened in force to the cosmic events that triggered previous extinction events. And I'm sure many of you will know that philosophers who like to get giddy about the way that the Anthropocene concept disorients our sense of ethics and ontology in my view, contribute to this sort of abstract sense of what it means to live in the sixth extinction. And I cite this quote from Timothy Morton as typical. So Morton says, "It's our turn to be the asteroid because the global warming that we cause is now bringing about the sixth mass extinction." But then he goes on to say, "Now it may sound strange, but something about the vagueness of kind of sort of finding yourself in the Anthropocene, which he says is equivalent to mass extinction, is in fact essential and intrinsic to the fact of being in such an age." And I've struggled for a long time about what I find so dissatisfactory about that sort of analysis, or uninspiring. And I think it's that I think Morton's own metaphor for what he himself is trying to achieve fails in the same way that, in my view, the allegory behind the film, the Netflix film Don't Look Up, does. So the meteor as external cosmic event undermines the more difficult challenge of thinking the crisis as in some way us. And surely we do want to evoke human agency and lived experience, even everyday experience, as our window onto this planetary shift. So rather than thinking of the concept of mass extinction like some kind of meta-narrative of our times, a hyper-object under whose shadow all of the day-to-day ecological catastrophes are somehow subsumed, surely what is needed is to listen even more carefully to those who do live in its shadow, especially those whose voices are ignored and erased. Another problem is that by citing the cause of the sixth extinction as humanity or simply us, we erase the political critique of extinction as perpetrated by systems of injustice, acts of violence by particular human groups against others. Generalized too, it seems, are the victims of mass extinction, often portrayed as an undifferentiated mass, whereas in reality, of course, the victims of ecological collapse expose horrifically the inequalities that already exist between humans and other creatures. A further questionable tendency, in my view, is to portray mass extinction as an unprecedented global crisis that only now appears on our horizon. So Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powers-White argues that this kind of crisis epistemology is endemic in environmental discourses, particularly of the global north, and essentially enables a collective forgetting of previous instances of world-ending crises, such as genocide and ecocide in settler colonialism. So there was a dangerous tendency here to frame extinction as an event in the future, but retrieving its meaning from the deep past, as opposed to an experience of the unfolding present, including a present that is actively resisted, contested through acts of surviving, adapting, and opposing the root causes of the crisis. Now we can see how heritage institutions like natural history museums might participate in that tendency towards abstraction. And I couldn't help throwing in a Dodo slide because I knew that Sugata would be talking at length about them. But by situating this mode of archiving, so telling a story of a deep temporal past, the display of fossils, skeletons, taxidermied endlings, the last of a species, we situate our present moment within a geological narrative. And there is, I think, a temptation to view mass extinction in that way, as imagined as an irresistible external force that is overtaking us. Historians of extinction science note that in the time of settler colonialism, that same narrative fueled an acceptance of the tragic but inevitable decline and extinction of primitive peoples upon encounter with Europeans, prompting a frantic anthropological quest to preserve as much as possible of their vanishing customs, beliefs, and artifacts. So this is just some of the background concern to an AHRC funded research project that I've been leading since 2019. It's now coming to a close. And it was originally titled Thinking Through Extinction. It was a collaborative project working with museums and artists, both areas which were entirely new to me. So a really new sort of type of research project, and probably one of the reasons that it was so fun. the project itself was a response to an EU-funded call for projects about cultural heritage. And our team chose to focus on the theme of extinction with the idea of interrogating the uses of museums and art galleries and engaging publics with the mass extinction crisis. So for us, a starting point was this hunch that mass extinction troubles modes of representation, and also the norms to which the observatory format of a museum space is designed. So actually using the project to question the appropriateness of staging some kind of representation of mass extinction to a museum public. I approached Manchester Museum to be project partner because as a university museum, they already had strong research-led, climate-focused exhibitions, and one of, I think now many museums engaging in self-critical exploration of what it means to be a museum in a time of climate crisis. And I commissioned an artist, Lou Chappelle, who in the bottom photo is wearing the green skirt, in part to respond to the collections of the museum, although in fact the project was launched just as lockdowns all over the country began, so actual engagement with the museum was quite difficult in the end. But she was given free rein to produce an artwork exploring what it means for publics to understand and feel and respond to the concept of mass extinction crisis. Lou Chappelle is based in Liverpool, and we approached Lou first because she had no direct background experience in that very subject, extinction, that we were trying to interrogate. And we saw this as a strength. But second, her artistic practice is always to work in and with local communities to co-produce artworks, often reflecting lived experience, histories, and identities. So the result was a collaborative production by a team of visual and performing artists, and members of the public who attended their workshops. And whose activities formed the final video. And especially in the second iteration of the project, we got follow-on funding. We sought out local groups who are underrepresented in cultural and political engagement with extinction, a forum that in our experience we found to be dominated by typically white, environmentally conscious scholars or activists. So our workshops included children, asylum seeker and refugee groups, and faith communities. So in the last stage of the project, the creative team worked with members of a local Buddhist temple. And our intention was never to inform the content of the artwork didactically or to start with definitions as such, but rather to start with the kind of broadest conversations on the different meanings of mass extinction, and to invite that creative team to explore with their participants through dance, poetry, animation, and drawing. So for instance, a workshop of paper flower making allowed participants to remember plant species that evoked home for them, sometimes powerfully and emotionally so. And the accounts of some of the participants, some of whom had arrived very recently in the country as asylum seekers, was very powerful in terms of using, sometimes with very minimal English or translations, concepts derived from our dialogue about what the extinction crisis meant to people, drew out many opportunities for telling stories of what that evoked for them in terms of their own situations of precarity or identity, ideas of home, etc. So the final artwork was a visual and musical collation of those experiences, a two-layered holographic video with images, movements, words, and music produced in the workshops, a clip of which I'll show at the end. But the art was as much about the process and the quality of the engagement with feelings around extinction by participants as it was about the final work. And the project evolved in this way. So we explored different art forms, We also commissioned creative writers to respond to the workshops and published the results of this with the art writing platform Corridor 8, a one-off publication facing extinction. And Chappelle's constructions were as important a design feature as the videos they housed. So in the first iteration, it was this wooden cabinet parodying the Kensington cabinet design that recalls the Victorian Museum. So observers would need to sit close, peering in as one would see a taxidermy animal. The second was inspired by conversations with Buddhist monks at the temple in Runcorn near Liverpool, and was loosely based on the spirit houses that one finds in Thailand and other East Asian countries, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. But retelling the story of how this artwork came about, I'm struck by my own reticence to lead a project about mass extinction from any informed position about what mass extinction is, or what perceptions, responses, and emotions it ought to elicit. So another strong feature of our project was to challenge the sort of dominant affective mode of representing extinction in terms of mourning or grieving, perhaps arguably to the expense of expense of other forms of engagement. In any case, voicing silence, which is the name of this artwork, which has now been exhibited in museums, galleries, and toured UK light festivals, invited curiosity from its observers. So nothing about its design suggests the theme of extinction at first sight. But my worry now was that it had become so diffuse in its approach that the focus on its subject was now lost. The artwork is undoubtedly aesthetically beautiful and compelling, but was it able to have that critical edge necessary for challenging our perceptions? As Persephone Pearl had challenged us in a consultation for the project, were we unsettled by it? Did we, academics, artists, members of the public, leave feeling uncomfortable, provoked? And I'm still assessing my response to that. On the other hand, for me, a strong vindication of the project's aims was its challenge to that passive and past-facing narrative of extinction, which I talked about in just earlier. So the haunting two-layered holograph, which you'll see in a moment, of overlapping bodies, voices, and sounds, is full of life. Extinction is evoked, sometimes obliquely, sometimes directly, as in the naming of extinct and endangered plants, but as a lively topic even when it is mournful. There is an urgency to the whirling dance movements and hands holding tight. There is also reverence and mystery. Those who wrote comments to adorn the artwork at our invitation at the side of the house showed a resonance across several registers and emotional registers and along a broad spectrum. Some expressed rage, a politically attuned sense of knowing what the crisis meant and who is causing it, but others expressed wonder at being alive at such a time. There were expressions of acceptance, some of helplessness. The appeal to religious symbols and stories was also able to negotiate some of the paradoxes of extinction imagination that I mentioned. So, for instance, in my view, the Thai-inspired Spirit House was serendipitous and pushes reflection in a number of possible directions. So Chappelle was originally attracted to the idea of the Spirit House as an idea of shelter, this idea of a place to house the spirits who inhabited the land before us. But this pre-Buddhist tradition of spirit houses are also an acknowledgement of forces that can threaten. Professor Martin Seeger at the University of Leeds notes that spirit houses in Thailand do not conform to the idea of shrines in the West, being, in his words, both public monuments and private memorials, a sentiment wholly appropriate for this attempt to grapple with the subject of extinction. They're also not places of grieving in the mode of Western roadside shrines, for example, rather of worship. And in the animistic belief from which they derive, the spirits of the deceased, particularly unnatural deaths, are believed to linger unhappily in that place. Ursula Heiser wrote that extinction becomes part of the stories that human communities tell about themselves, stories about their origins, their development, their identity, and their future horizons. And the most important stories in this project were those of the artwork's participants. Its meanings to those who took part were astonishingly diverse and thought-provoking. So whilst extinction is a problem to the public imagination, the claim that I started with, in the course of the workshops that led to this artwork, interviews and conversations as well, people did not need an extinction crisis explaining to them. The meanings of extinction unfolded as stories that feel, in my view, hidden behind the planetary meta-narrative I've critiqued, and are all the more urgent for it. From Namibia, an asylum seeker recalled seeing the now extinct white rhino as a child, but also in the same breath speaking of the fear he had for the disappearance of his mother language, for the words of trees and plants that will disappear with it. An agricultural engineer from Syria, now seeking refuge in the UK, spoke about the fragile attempts to conserve his country's biodiversity through donating seeds to the global seed vault. And I want to end with words from an interview with Naima, a refugee from Palestine, who took part in the project. I've experienced extinction. My parents are dead. My grandparents are dead as well. But still, I am alive, fighting against extinction, fighting against the assimilation or the denial of my identity as a Palestinian. When I went to the hospital in May, they asked me how old I am and what country I come from. I said Palestine. Palestine was not on their list. This is extinction, isn't it? And finally, if I may, I would just like to show you a brief clip. It's actually a promotional clip. It's not the artwork itself, and obviously you're not going to see it in the holographic form. But I will stop share and then share again. Is that okay, Ryan? Do we have time to share 2-minute clip?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I need to do something first. I need to turn.
Remembering, wiped out. Place. It affects us all. Soil. To find remnants and evidence, language, obliterated, gone, traditions, forgotten, murdered, displaced, removed, destroyed, left, vanishing, forced, displacement, echoes, loss of identity, absence, disappearing, left without trace, identity, a memory of, adaptation, no evidence, new, archaeology, digging and digging, control, ancestors, oppression, ritual, it affects us all, every single living, breathing, the humans and the non-humans, wiped out, and loss, preservation, time capsules, mollusks, between imprints, species, wiped out, nature and erased, connections with flowers and plants, life is transient, folklore, religions, we can love a place and still be dangerous to it, understanding we can love a place and still be dangerous collective to it. Will, need for collective action, cross-species kinship, co-existence, cooperation, consideration. We have. What is your vision of nature? Because we seem to live in an age where the unnatural has become the natural. Understanding the norm is so abnormal. What is your vision of nature? Will. Remembering, wiped out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Once again, please feel free to put questions in the chat or in the question and answer function. While we do that, I'm going to invite the two panelists, if either would like to make a comment or ask a question of the other, an opportunity for a little dialogue.
I did have a question I wanted to put to Sugata, actually, because when you were talking about when you were reading from this elegy of the Dodo, I got the sense in which this same idea of a narrative of this sort of inevitable force of modernity is going on, and that's something that I'm doing something bad. So that was something that I have been more aware is part of extinction narratives generally through history. It's like this idea of a force that's ineluctable. It can't be resisted. Is that kind of what's going on in your story of the Dodo?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's sort of the central framework in which colonialism and European modernity function. And you mentioned people as well, not just non-human life forms. And the idea of colonialism and so the dispersal of modernity is precisely that. With European modernity, those who cannot fit in that global narrative or global project of modernity are sidelined, are become extinct. So I think from the very beginning, in terms of early modern science, and of course continuing on to even like, let's say, 20th century narrative, it's about this inevitability of extinction of species, especially outside North America and Western Europe, or especially outside Western Europe. I wouldn't say North America, because the same narrative plays out in North America as well. And I think that is something that even Ursula Heiss would talk about, how this is more about the loss of biodiversity becomes a metaphor for our imminent extinction. Yeah. And I think that's the sort of interesting relationship between narratives of extinction and sort of modernity.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Good. Please go ahead.
Well, I wondered whether part of your project is to see how stories like the story of the Dodo are being used to perpetuate that, even now.
Absolutely. I think that's the fundamental part here, is to look at what because again, I mean, as I was working on this project, when we think about art, we think about it as enabling social justice, as enabling a certain politics, radical politics. But what happens when we look at artistic cultures as enabling violence? And that's what, when we look at, let's say, early modern visual representations, what we see is an enabling of a certain stereotype, an enabling of colonialism. And I think that role between colonialism and the visual cultures of colonialism, and how it produced a discursive framework of remorse, but inevitability.
Sure.
May I ask a question, or should we move on, Ryan?
Go ahead.
So I was actually thinking about all the projects that are happening in terms of like the museums, the protests that are happening in museums, especially in England with climate change, and I wonder how you negotiate that history of corporate sponsorship, often with companies that are part of this sort of this conglomerate of global climate violence, and sort of a radical project that is presented in a museum instead of, let's say, a larger discursive framework that would say decolonize the museum, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder how you, I mean, it's a very complicated negotiation, which we all do. We are all complicit in one way or the other with our funding, with ways we work and function in sort of neoliberal capitalist worlds. But I'm curious whether you actually worked out that complicity.
Yeah, so one of the slides that I removed shortly before presenting this was of the die-in staged by XR at the Natural History Museum in London a few years ago. But actually, so that's I think that's an ongoing concern in terms of institutions and their affiliation. Dominic O'Key, who was postdoc on this project, has written a great article about exactly that, museums and their role in extinction activism. But for me, the interest is really that event showed just how much the museum space has become a terrain of political contestation, because it struck me that when XR activists staged the die-in right underneath the skeleton of a blue whale, they're all straightforward political protest, but they're also sort of contesting the temporality that we should be associating with extinction, right? So for XR, it's very much want to make it clear that humans are going extinct, and yet we're doing so in a place in which, as in my view, the connection is to this sort of grand meta-narrative of deep time association. So it's a really interesting moment where museums that are used to that passive observer role are now becoming a political terrain for urgent action. So yeah, it's a really interesting time for museums, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you both. So here's a question that is for both of you. And the question is whether you could speak about the difference between, or similarities between, erasure and extinction. I'm guessing this is coming up in part at the end of your presentation, Stefan, where you're talking about extinction, but also talking about various forms of human erasure under the category of extinction. But the question is for either of you.
Erasure versus extinction.
I'm happy to take go ahead and take the first stab.
Yeah,
I think because I think fundamentally, at least in my research, which is of course in an earlier period, the question of erasure has something to do with the question of agency, right? And the idea that animals have agency is sort of a liberal framework, and in the human sense of, or a political neoliberal sense of what agency is. And I think, I mean, I could not address it in the short time that we had, but I think there's this idea that we can recover agency, and we can recover the animal's agency. And I've written elsewhere that is sort of fundamentally a flawed argument, because going back to Gayatri Spivak's argument of subalternity, and that as a species, as sort of a differentiated species, how do we as human beings even recover that agency? So the question is about agency and erasure, is that we will forever function within a domain of erasure, and then read the archive maybe against the grain to perhaps think of other ways of articulating agency, if we at all can. But I love Stefan's example of the person from Palestine talking about extinction as erasure in a way. I think that's a very powerful. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, and actually there were lots of instances in which individuals' response to this really broad general theme spoke immediately about erasure in lots of different senses. So so for some people it seems that there's a sense of identity and home, that's so there's multiple senses of erasure in terms of a threat to identity from where they're coming from, if they're coming from conflict, but also being exiled themselves, being in a new place, and but also, you know, this sense of erasure as language as well as ecosystems. Just the fact that these are the stories, the conversations that were had in the course of making and creating things, as opposed to tell us what the meaning of extinction is. You know, this very academic sort of sense of let's look at the roots of that word and let's look at all the different ways. So it was very humbling and a real honor to hear some of those stories.
So here's a comment and question from Marilyn Tucker. So she says, while I sympathize with the critique of large meta-narratives about extinction, this problem does need to be seen as both global and local at the same time. And she mentions the Hall of Biodiversity at the Natural History Museum in New York City as a potential model for showing both what is being lost and what is being restored. So I guess maybe an open invitation to respond to her comment.
I mean, I'll just say quickly that I absolutely do not dispute that it's important to talk about this extinction as a sort of planetary event. I guess my critique is, how is that possible to do? How is it something that engages the lives of people? And the reason I started with Timothy Morton is because I think that he's the kind of person that thinks we ought to think planetary through this sort of uncanny everydayness, but ends up sounding like the way to do that is to sort of shrug your shoulders and say, well, isn't this a funny philosophical situation we find ourselves in? And that's the sort of conceptual problem that I think we face. So for me, it's, how do we talk about the planetary? Is it through these sort of allegories of being a force of nature, or is it actually looking at the lives and lifeways that are disrupted and have been disrupted for centuries? That's my critique.
I'll just add on to that. I think even with sort of this idea that human species now has a force, as a planetary force, what it does is it evacuates the species from responsibility. Because if we are like a glacier or an asteroid, we don't have to actually have responsibility for our action, because we are a geological force. And going back to Deepesh's argument about the human species as a geological force. And I think what I want to do in my project to say that maybe we are a geological force, but the history of extinction, who is responsible for extinction? And it has to be, that question of origins matter. Is it 1960s? Is it atomic testing? Is it industrial revolution? Or is it, let's say, the colonization of North America that begins this origin, that begins the story of extinction? And I think for me, the question of the meta-narrative is that what is the origin story of extinction? And my interest in European art is not because of its primacy, but about responsibility. And trying to think about the relationship between primacy and responsibility in terms of extinction and the origin story. And it matters, like, where do we begin?
Thanks. Maybe we'll do one more question. Terry Marsh has a few questions for Sugata. So one has to do with the sense of the inevitability of extinction in the 17th century, which I think you've already at least partly addressed. Another has to do with whether the archival record shows any sense of humans being remorseful for hunting and trapping of species to extinction.
So I mean, that's a very interesting question. And the idea of extinction, of course, goes back to Comte de Buffon or George Cuvier, who started talking about extinction. But even before that, you have accounts that talk about violence against the dodo, since we're talking about the dodo, but you have early 1630s, you have accounts, or even a 1602 account that talks about like how the Dutch are being violent and killing dodos. So while it would not be posited in the realm of extinction until, let's say, Buffon or Cuvier, it also has to be situated within sort of inter-European rivalry. You criticize the other colonizer for being cruel, and so there is that sort of inter-European rivalry that's playing out when we think about criticisms of violence against non-human species in the early modern archives.
Thank you. And I'll note that a number of people asked in the questions about access to the video that Stefan shared, and I see that he just put some information in the chat on that. So if you're interested in that, check out the chat. So let me just close by thanking you both so much for these very rich presentations, this conversation, the fascinating ways in which these projects interact with one another. And I want to, before we end, remind everybody that, again, there's one more event in this series, which requires a separate registration. So please don't forget to register. That we put the link for that in the chat. The last webinar, which is next Friday, is called Remembering Lost Species, Rituals for the Anthropocene. And it features Persephone Pearl, Emily Lawrence, and Rachel Porter, who are the co-founders of Feral Theater and also co-creators of Remembrance Day for Lost Species. So I hope you'll all join us for that. And let me once again say thank you to our presenters.